Can 1 minute of vigorous physical activity really give you the same health benefit as 4, 5, or 9 minutes of moderate activity? And what if I told you that for one outcome in a recent study, 1 minute of this vigorous activity corresponded to more than 2.5 hours of light physical activity? Sounds almost unbelievable, right? But these numbers come from a fascinating 2025 study published in Nature Communications. So, should we all stop our long walks and simply exercise hard for a few minutes? Not so fast. Because the numbers are real, but what those numbers mean is much more interesting. Welcome to another episode of my exercise series, where we look at recent evidence about exercise and try to understand what it actually means for our health. By the end of this video, you will understand 5 things: why researchers are questioning the traditional idea that 1 minute of vigorous activity equals 2 minutes of moderate activity, how wearable devices are changing exercise research, why vigorous physical activity appears remarkably time efficient, and why 1 minute of vigorous activity does not literally replace an hour or 2 hours of lighter activity. And finally, how we can translate this evidence sensibly into our own exercise programs. And if you are short of time, you can skip directly to the final section of this video where I will give you the 5 key take-home messages. But if you have a few minutes, stay with me, because this paper gives us an excellent lesson not only about exercise but also about how to interpret medical research without being misled by an exciting headline. First, what did the researchers do? The study was published in Nature Communications in 2025 by Biswas and colleagues. The researchers analyzed 73,485 participants from the UK Biobank. The average age at the accelerometer assessment was approximately 62 years, and the average follow-up was approximately 8 years. During that period, the researchers examined outcomes including all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, MACE, that is major adverse cardiovascular events, type 2 diabetes, physical activity related cancer outcomes. But there was something particularly interesting about how physical activity was measured. The researchers did not simply ask people, how much exercise did you do last week? Participants wore a wrist accelerometer continuously for 7 days, and using a machine learning algorithm, movement was classified into light, moderate, and vigorous activity in windows as short as 10 seconds. Why is that important? Because questionnaire depends on our memory. You may remember your 45 minutes of morning walk, but you probably won't remember every time you climbed the stairs quickly, hurried across the road, or moved vigorously for 30 seconds. So wearable devices can potentially capture these short bursts of movement much more precisely, and that may change how we understand the relationship between physical activity, intensity, and health. The traditional 1 to 2 rule. For many years, physical activity guidelines have commonly treated 1 minute of vigorous activity as approximately equivalent to 2 minutes of moderate activity. This is why guidelines commonly recommend either 150 to 300 minutes of moderate to intensity physical activity per week, or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity physical activity, or an equivalent combination. The traditional 2 to 1 weighting largely reflects the difference in metabolic energy expenditure between vigorous and moderate activities. But the authors of this study asked a different question. Instead of asking how much energy does each intensity use, they essentially asked how much activity at each intensity is associated with similar reduction in important long-term health outcomes. And that's where things become very interesting. The results. For all-cause mortality, 1 minute of vigorous physical activity corresponded to approximately 4.1 minutes of moderate activity. For major adverse cardiovascular events, MACE, approximately 5.4 minutes. For cardiovascular mortality, approximately 7.8 minutes. And for type 2 diabetes, approximately 9.4 minutes of moderate activity for every minute of vigorous activity. For physical activity related cancer mortality, the figure was approximately 3.5 minutes. And for physical activity related cancer incidence, approximately 1.6 minutes. So there wasn't one universal conversion ratio. It depended upon the health outcome being studied, But for several cardiovascular and metabolic outcomes, the difference between the moderate and vigorous activity was much larger than the familiar 1 to 2 convention. And then comes the numbers that make the headlines. When the researchers compared vigorous activity with the light activity, the differences became enormous. For all-cause mortality, 1 minute vigorous corresponded to approximately 53 minutes light. For cardiovascular mortality, approximately 72 minutes light. For MACE, approximately 86 minutes light. And for type 2 diabetes, approximately 94 minutes light physical activity. And for physical activity related cancer mortality, approximately 156 minutes of light activity. Now imagine the headline, 1 minute of vigorous exercise equals 156 minutes of light activity. It seems very attractive and potentially very misleading, because now we need to understand what the researchers actually mean by the word equivalent. What does equivalent actually mean? This is probably the most important part of today's video. The researchers did not conduct a randomized trial where one group performed 1 minute of vigorous exercise and another group performed 53, 94 or 156 minutes of light activity. Instead, this was an observational study. In simple language, the researchers observed how much activity people were doing, followed them over time, and examined how different amounts and intensities of activity were associated with subsequent health outcomes. Then they constructed what researchers call dose response curves. You can think of these simply as graphs asking, as the amount of activity increases, what happens to the risk of disease or death. The researchers then compared the points on these curves where the estimated reduction in risk was similar. From those comparisons came these equivalence ratio. So when this paper says 1 minute of vigorous corresponds to approximately 53 minutes of light activity for all-cause mortality, it does not mean do 1 minute of vigorous exercise instead of walking for 53 minutes. It means that within this observational data set and statistical model, those amounts were associated with comparable levels of estimated risk reduction at particular points on their respective dose response curves. This is very important difference. Association is not substitution. This gives us a simple phrase worth remembering. Association is not substitution. The study demonstrates interesting associations between activity intensity and health outcomes. It does not prove that we can simply exchange one form of activity for another using a mathematical formula. So please don't interpret this as 9 minutes moderate equals 1 minute vigorous, or 53 minutes of light activity equals 1 minute of vigorous, or 2.5 hours of light movement can simply be replaced by a 60 seconds of hard exercise. Those conclusions go beyond what this study actually demonstrates. And this is one of the most important lessons whenever we read observational research. Why might vigorous activity look so much more powerful? One important reason raised by researchers is measurement accuracy. Traditional exercise studies often rely on questionnaires, and questionnaires are particularly good at capturing small amounts of activity scattered throughout the day. The wearable approach used here analyzed movement in 10-second windows. So it could potentially capture short, vigorous bursts that traditional questionnaires might miss. Measurement errors in self-reported physical activity can also weaken observed relationships, a statistical problem that can include something called regression dilutional bias. That sounds complicated, but the basic idea is simple. If your measurement of exercise is imprecise, the true relationship between exercise and health may appear weaker than it really is. The author suggests that this may partly explain why wearable-based measurements produced a much larger difference between vigorous and moderate activity than older self-reported studies. But we also need to understand the limitations. This was a large and sophisticated study, but large does not automatically mean perfect. First is this was an observational research. So it can demonstrate associations, but it cannot prove that vigorous activity itself caused all of the observed differences. There may still be what researchers call residual confounding. In simple terms, people who perform vigorous activity may differ from less active people in other ways that are difficult to measure completely. Second, physical activity was measured over a relatively short period. Participants needed at least 3 valid days of accelerometer recording, including a weekend day. But the average follower was approximately 8 years. Think about yourself 8 years ago. Were you exercising exactly the same way? Probably not. People change, they become fitter, they become less active, they gain or lose weight, they develop illness, they suffer injuries, their exercises habits change. So, the wearable gives us a valuable snapshot of physical activity. It does not guarantee that a person's activity remained identical throughout the following 8 years. And there is something called reverse causality. This sounds a little complicated, but the concept is actually quite simple. Imagine someone has an illness, hasn't yet been diagnosed. Because they are becoming unwell, they gradually become less physically active. Several years later, they develop a major health event. So we may conclude low activity caused disease. But part of what actually happened may have been early disease caused the low activity. That is reverse causality. The researchers tried to reduce this problem. They excluded relevant pre-existing disease for specific analysis and excluded participants who experienced an event during the first year of follow-up. That is an important strength in the study, but the authors themselves acknowledge that reverse causality cannot be completely eliminated. Another important point about wearables, an accelerometer measures movement, but movement intensity and physiological effort aren't always exactly the same thing. Imagine a trained runner and a previously sedentary person climbing the same hill. Their external movement may look similar, but internally, their heart rates, oxygen requirements, perceived effort, and physiological stress could be very different. The accelerometers in this study quantified absolute movement intensity rather than directly measuring each individual's physiological response during every activity. The authors note previous evidence suggesting that adjusting absolute intensity for factors such as age, sex, height, and weight did not materially change associations with mortality. Nevertheless, it remains an important distinction when we try to translate population level research into an exercise program for one individual. In simple language, what a wearable classifies as vigorous movement does not necessarily represent exactly the same physiological challenge for every person. So, should we dismiss the study? No. That would be making the opposite mistake. The study gives us a very important message that intensity appears to matter. Both moderate and vigorous physical activity showed favorable dose-response associations across the outcomes studied. Vigorous activity showed particular pronounced relationships for several mortality and cardiometabolic outcomes. Light activity showed considerably weaker relationships for several outcomes. So, there is a practical message here for someone who says, Doctor, I understand exercise is important, but I simply don't have another 10 hours every week. The answer may not always be exercise for much longer. For an appropriate selected individual, part of the answer could potentially be introduce some appropriately higher intensity activity. Intensity may allow us to obtain a meaningful physiological stimulus in less time. And then this is important. Time efficiency does not mean everyone should suddenly start exercising vigorously. More intensity is not automatically better for everyone. Vigorous exercise places greater demand on the body. Whether it is appropriate depends upon factors such as your current fitness, your age, your medical history, your symptoms, your previous exercise experience, and your ability to tolerate and recover from the exercises. For someone who has been sedentary for years, progressing from light activity to regular moderate exercise may itself be an excellent achievement. Higher intensity can then be introduced progressively where appropriate. So please don't watch this video and decide from tomorrow sprinting. That is not the message. Should we then abandon moderate exercise? Definitely not. Exercise isn't simply about finding the intensity associated with the lowest hazard ratio and doing only that. Moderate intensity aerobic exercise allows us to accumulate substantial training volume at a manageable physiological cost. It can help build an aerobic foundation. Higher intensity activity can provide another powerful stimulus, and light physical activity keeps us moving through the rest of the day instead of spending prolonged periods completely inactive. So rather than ask which one should I choose, light, moderate, or vigorous, I prefer another question: how can these different intensities work together? For many people, that is a far more useful approach to exercise. What about your smartwatch? This paper also raises an important, interesting question about how wearable devices reward exercises. Many activities systems give greater credit to vigorous exercise than to moderate exercise. The author suggests that device-based evidence like this could eventually help refine physical activity guidelines and the algorithms used in consumer wearable devices. Could our watch eventually give vigorous activity considerably more weight? Possibly. But I wouldn't rewrite your exercise program or your smartwatch algorithm based on one observational study. These findings need further replication and validation. So is the old 1 to 2 rule wrong? I wouldn't put it that way. The traditional 1 to 2 convention and this study are not asking exactly the same question. The traditional convention largely reflects differences in the metabolic cost of moderate and vigorous activities. The study asks a somewhat different question. So is the old 1 to 2 rule wrong? I wouldn't put it that way. The traditional 1 to 2 convention and this study are not exactly the same question. The traditional convention largely reflects differences in the metabolic costs of moderate and vigorous activities. This study asks a somewhat different question. When activity is objectively measured, how are different intensities associated with long-term health outcome? And its results suggest that the relationship between intensity, time, and health may be considerably more complicated than a simple 1 to 2 conversion. So rather than saying the old guidelines were wrong, I would say this study challenges us to rethink whether a simple 1 to 2 formula fully captures the relationship between physical activity, intensity, and long-term health. This is probably the more accurate way to interpret these findings. Now comes Doraisami's interpretation. A few days later, Doraisami came to my clinic looking unusually pleased with himself. He said, "Doctor, I understood your video. That statement itself made me slightly nervous." He continued, "1 minute vigorous activity can correspond to 53 minutes of light activity, correct?" I said, "Doraisami, that is an important qualification." No, doctor, I understood perfectly." Kamala, his wife, sitting beside him, immediately said, "Really?" I looked at her. "What happened?" Kamala said, "Yesterday I asked him to walk with me for 1 hour. I looked at Doraisami. He smiled proudly. I optimized it, doctor." How? Kamala answered before he could. He wore his smartwatch, ran around the house for 1 minute, and spent the remaining 59 minutes on the sofa watching television. Doraisami said quietly, "According to science." Kamala looked at him. "According to science, you are eating mixture." Doraisami looked at him hopefully. "Doctor, statistically," I told him, "Doraisami, association is not substitution. And now go for the walk." Kamala smiled and Doraisami didn't. And that may be the simplest way to understand this entire paper. The 5 key take-home messages from this video. For those of you who had joined me here because you were short of time, welcome. Here are the 5 key things I want everyone to remember from this video. Number 1, intensity matters. Physical activity isn't simply about accumulating minutes. The intensity of those minutes may influence their relationship with long-term health. Number 2, vigorous activity appears remarkably time efficient. In this variable-based observational study, 1 minute of vigorous activity corresponded to approximately 4 to 9 minutes of moderate activity for several mortality and cardiometabolic outcomes. That is considerably different from the traditional 1 to 2 convention. Number 3, these are not exercise exchange rates. This is probably the most important message. 1 minute of vigorous activity has not been proven to replace 9 minutes of moderate exercises or 53 minutes of light activity or 156 minutes of light activity. These numbers come from comparing associations on observational dose response curves. Remember, association is not substitution. And number 4, don't make light, moderate, and vigorous activity compete with each other. Light activity helps keep us moving. Moderate exercise allows us to accumulate aerobic volume. An appropriately prescribed vigorous exercise can provide a powerful high-intensity stimulus. For many people, a sensible exercise program can contain elements of all three. Number 5, don't chase the mathematical ratio. Don't suddenly start vigorous exercise simply because one study produced an impressive number. Build your activity progressively and appropriately for your current health and fitness. Because the real message from this study isn't 1 minute replaces 1 hour. The better message is intensity matters, but so do the volume, progression, individual fitness, and context. And perhaps that is the most useful way to translate this fascinating paper into everyday life. And this brings us to the next question. Before we finish, there is one more interesting question. We have spent this video talking about vigorous physical activity, but does vigorous activity always have to mean going to the gym, running for 30 minutes, or doing a formal high intensity workout? What about running up a flight of stairs, walking very quickly uphill, or doing short bursts of harder activity during everyday life? Researchers have started studying something called VILPA, vigorous intermittent lifestyle physical activity. These are very short bursts of vigorous activity that happens as part of everyday life. There is also a related concept called exercise snacking, brief bouts of deliberately performed exercises spread throughout the day. They are related ideas, but they are not exactly the same. And some of the emerging findings are fascinating, particularly for people who don't regularly exercise. So, how little vigorous physical activity might actually make a difference? That's what we are going to look at in the next episode of the exercise series. I'll see you there in the next video. Goodbye. Disclaimer: this video is for general information and educational purpose only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is formed through this video. The useful use of information presented in this video or in the materials linked to this video is at the viewer's own risk. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Viewers should not disregard or delay obtaining medical advice because of information presented in this video. Anyone with a medical condition, symptoms, concerns about exercise safely, or questions about starting or increasing the intensity of exercise programs should seek appropriate advice from their healthcare professional. See you in the next video, friends. Until then, goodbye.